So today I'm sitting here with Philip Fernbach. Phil, thank you for chatting with me.
My pleasure.
So I've been watching your TED Talks and reading some of your work. And you talk a lot about the illusion of explanatory depth. What does that mean?
The illusion of explanatory depth is a phenomenon from psychology, which is basically that we overestimate how well we understand the world. Illusion of explanatory depth is kind of the jargony cognitive science term. I also sometimes refer to it as an illusion of understanding or a knowledge illusion. This is a phenomenon that was first studied by a guy named Frank Kyle in the 1990s. He's a psychologist at Yale, and some of his colleagues. And in the typical study, they would have people come into the lab, and they would ask them to introspect about how well they understand some kind of common everyday object. My favorite example is a toilet. So you ask somebody, how well do you understand how a toilet works? And people kind of nod their head and say, yeah, I have a decent sense of that. But in the second part of the experiment, what they do is ask the participant to explain in detail exactly how it works. And then something really interesting happens, which is that people realize that they actually don't know very much at all. And they have this kind of dawning realization that it's much more complex than they initially appreciated. And I've gotten very interested in this phenomenon because I think it's not really about toilets or other kinds of everyday objects, but it's kind of about everything. And it's a really fundamental part of who we are as human beings. That we tend to think that we understand the world better than we actually do.
Are there certain things that we are more misunderstanding of? Like we'll say we better understand, but in reality we understand worse off, or is it all the same?
There are differences across different kinds of items, and some things are more surprising in their complexity. If something, it almost seems obvious, but if something seems simple, but it's in fact complex, we're going to be more likely to overestimate our understanding. If you ask somebody how well they understand the ins and outs of quantum physics, well, actually, if you ask people that in Boulder, they will say that they understand quantum physics, but they often mean something quite different by that. But if you ask somebody about some arcane, complex topic, they might just realize that they don't know. But the truth is that most things are more complex than they seem, and so this is true of most things. I guess another thing to point out is that some people are more susceptible to this illusion than others. People who habitually are less overconfident and who habitually sort of check their understanding more often are less susceptible to overestimating. But that's not the norm. Most humans, most people tend to fall prey to this illusion all the time. I know I myself fall for it all the time.
So why do we fall for it? Is it innate? Is it a failure of education? Is it some combination? What actually is at fault there?
Well, the answer to that question is fairly complex, and I guess I've got a book. It's called The Knowledge Illusion, and the entire book is trying to unpack why we believe, me and my co-author Steve Sloman, why we believe that this is so prevalent. And let me try to give you the contours of an answer. The human mind is not evolved and did not develop for individual thinking. That's a main argument of the book. The world is just too complex. Even simple things have hidden layers of complexity to them. And no individual mind could master the world in all of its detail and complexity. It would just be futile to try to do that. So what appears to be the case is that human beings evolved for group collaboration. We evolved capacities to store small amounts of information about the world, not to store a lot of detailed information, and to specialize so that some people are experts at some bits of information, others are experts at other bits of information. And then we evolved capacities to be able to engage in collaborative thinking and collaborative goal pursuit, which is something that's really unique to human beings. No other animals can do this to the same extent. And this is a really special set of cognitive processes that is quite challenging. Just to be able to jointly pursue a goal with someone else requires things like appreciating that other person has a mind and has mental states and all this kind of stuff. And so we that seems to be human beings' unique capability. And if you look around the world at all of the things we do, I mean, we're sitting here staring at technology, and we got a microphone in front of us connected to a computer. Mm-hmm. And there's nobody in the world who can explain all the bits and pieces of any of this stuff that we have. Everything that we've built as human beings and societies requires this incredible distributed kind of knowledge and collaboration. That's really the secret of humanity. So it makes sense that we would be relatively ignorant as individuals, that we wouldn't know very much. So then the question becomes, why is it that we naturally tend to think we understand things when we don't?
Right.
And the answer there that we come to is that it has to do with the fact that it's so natural for us to participate in groups where the knowledge is distributed across the group. We call that a community of knowledge. It's so natural for us to participate in that just by virtue of participating in it, we tend to sort of not recognize the boundaries of where our own knowledge ends and knowledge that's stored elsewhere begins. Because we're always drawing on knowledge that's stored elsewhere. If I don't know something, I look it up on Google or I ask my friend or whatever. And if you think about the kinds of attitudes and beliefs that people have, like I think that we should have a particular kind of healthcare system, or I think that if we vote for such and such a candidate, they're going to do a good job, or I believe the planet is warming. All of those things are things that I myself don't understand in depth at all. Mm-hmm. Right? It's impossible for me to. There's just too much to know. And yet, by virtue of participating in a community where the requisite knowledge to maintain those positions exists outside of my own mind, I sort of fail to recognize what's in my own head and what's out there in the world. And so that's kind of the idea, is that we often don't recognize what's in our own heads and what's outside of our heads, because a lot of times it doesn't really matter. The information's out there somewhere, and that might be sufficient for us to sort of live our lives and go about our business.
So then oftentimes if you ask someone what do they believe, and they don't know exactly, if you really pin them down, they might be able to make an appeal to an authority, right?
Yeah.
This figure is an expert, and they could quote all the articles, and I trust them, right? So I wonder, what are your thoughts in this world we live in today, where I might argue because of social media and anonymity or pseudo-anonymity, others might argue it's other causes, where you have seemingly endless number of experts, people who in many cases are seemingly credentialed, right, who have done their scholarship and so forth, but still have extreme minority views. Mm-hmm. But it only takes one expert to start a community on Facebook that could have thousands and thousands of people. Yeah. Do you ever worry that part of our psychology is problematic? Are there any implications into politics and things like that you see coming from that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's sort of this very fundamental problem with the way that we get to our positions about the world, which is that we get them from the communities that we affiliate with and the people that we deem experts, because we can't possibly know enough to actually have reasoned positions on all of the things that we're supposed to have positions on, just based on what we ourselves know. And so what we end up doing is we end up appealing to the people in our communities that we trust. And if we trust the wrong people, then we can very easily get to positions that are incorrect. Or even, I mean, if it's uncertain, if the truth is uncertain, it's not necessarily incorrect, but we might have a strength of belief in that position that outstrips its likelihood. We're overconfident. And so it's a huge problem. And a lot of the times it's very difficult to know when we're sort of in a house of mirrors or a house of cards or whatever analogy that you want to have. Because if we don't have the knowledge to actually assess some issue in depth, we also lack the knowledge to really realize when someone else is full of shit or when we ourselves are overconfident. So lacking that knowledge means that like we can get to a position that can be pretty out there and pretty far off base, and the people we're listening to are just going to verify what we already believe. So it can be very hard to break out of that kind of thing.
So
for sure.
Then if we have to rely on community in some sense, following your claims, and we also have to recognize the potential failings of authority figures or even just people in our own in-group, if you will, how do you break out of that? Is it take this meditation course and you'll be self-aware? Is it K through 12 needs to be renovated? What actually, maybe this is just your opinion, but how do we escape that, or at least move in the right direction in this world?
There's no silver bullet, I don't think. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of these issues are complicated, and in the end, we do have to rely on others. However, I don't think it's impossible to be a little more thoughtful and deliberative than we tend to be. I mean, people buy into stuff. A lot of smart people will buy into stuff that's pretty verifiably unlikely to be true.
Right.
And they do it not because it's impossible to verify or to be a little more critical, but because we just tend not to. Mm. I mean, we get in the habit of just nodding along with whoever we trust. We develop some affinity for some podcaster or whatever, like yourself maybe, and whatever they say is just going to go, with very little critical thought. And so being a little more deliberative, a little more critical is important. And, not all credentials are created equal either.
Sure.
And then sometimes people are pretty sketchy with the way that they use credentials. It's like, this person's, they have a doctorate, they're a PhD. Therefore, I should trust them on whether I should be taking the COVID vaccine. Well, no, their PhD is actually in, religious studies or something. Right. It's like, I'm not picking on religion. That was just a random example I came up with. But
it's unrelated to vaccines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the point. And so I think being a little more thoughtful and deliberative, and also it's very important that once people get a particular position or have a particular position, the mind very naturally wants to maintain that position and find evidence for it, because it's hard to change our mind, and change our views, because a lot of the times a lot of things are wrapped up with a position that we maintain or a belief that we have. If you change one belief that's kind of central to who you are, it can lead to, can be scary, because now you have to change a lot of different things, a lot of different views and stuff like that. So trying to be a little more objective about considering the possibility that I might not have things right, I think is beneficial. Now, I say all that, and I would also argue on the flip side that you have to, one reaction to all this is to say, the world's just too uncertain, I can't possibly know anything, I can't have any positions, and that's not the way to go either. We have to have some level of belief and some level of conviction about the things that we believe. And so it's, there's, like I said, there's no silver bullet, but I do think if people habitually became a little more reflective and a little more critical about the sources of where they're getting their information from, I think you could at least, as you said, start moving in the right direction, not necessarily solve the problem.
Now, I always think about people's views, and maybe I'm wrong here. I mean, you're the cognitive scientist in the room, but I often think that people's views are amenable as they get older, but somewhat stuck, or at least very much entrenched in views that they got when they were younger.
Yeah.
I think that you often see kids, young children, as this pure, they're all kind of the same, they're not ever really racist or prejudiced, but they're also not the brightest, they're just kind of the same, right? And then as you shape them in some sense, your parenting style, then they have this framework built up that then, tell me if I'm wrong here, seems to be only gives them so much wiggle room. Like if you were raised to be so incredulous in your views, whatever those views are you not predisposed to just be an incredulous person?
Yeah, so I think what you're bringing up is really important, which is that, if you look at it, everybody thinks like their political views are correct and so on. Most of what we believe, like the best predictor is not any personality characteristics, it's certainly not IQ, it's none of those things, it's like, what geography do you live in? Mm-hmm. And that's weird. I mean, just because you grew up in Boston or because you grew up in rural Texas or whatever, you're going to end up believing like way different stuff.
Right.
And that's not because people in Boston are smarter than people in rural Texas. I mean, if you look at the statistics, that's not the case for the most part. They're not worse people in one or the other. They're not, habitually meaner or any of those kind of things. So It's like, you look at that as in a sort of an objective outside observing. You say, okay, maybe this isn't so like, maybe this does have something to do with just what we learned and the schemas that we have for understanding the world and stuff, or at least a big part of it. That's not 100% true. I mean, some people do kind of break out of the things that they were taught, and some people are more contrarian by nature and stuff, and so will question the things that they're being told to a greater extent. But those, I would argue, are more sort of explain less of the variance in the positions that people end up having in later life than just like who they're surrounded by. It's very hard to break out of everything you've been taught and believe. It's
right.
Like we're just not built that way. I mean, I think like society would not work very well either if we were built to be too contrarian and to be too questioning, because like I said, I mean, in order to really operate in the world, you have to have some beliefs, and therefore you sort of have to trust everyone around you. We can't get to beliefs ourselves. Like no human being can be a radical empiricist and get to all their beliefs in that way. So yeah, I think the way we're raised and the things we're brought up to believe are a huge part of where we end up as adults. And then of course there are personality differences. Some people are habitually more open-minded, more contrarian, more intellectually curious, for instance, perhaps. And some people are the opposite. So. That will also determine to some extent, like sort of that kind of wiggle room or flexibility or whatever.
Yeah, when I hear you talk about the knowledge illusion, it makes me think of the Dunning Krueger effect.
Yes.
How are they different? Or maybe explain what they are in actual correct terms for anyone who doesn't know.
Yeah, the concepts are closely related. So the Dunning Krueger effect is basically the idea that people without skills also don't have insight to their skill level. And one outcome of that is that the people who are the worst at a task can often be the most overconfident about their abilities at that task. So like, you can run a study with having people make jokes and then evaluate how funny those jokes are, have like a different set of people figure out how funny those jokes are, and then also have people self-assess like how funny they are. And what you often find is that the people who are the least funny think they're the funniest. And the idea is that those people lack the skill to be funny, but they also lack the skill to assess how funny they are. And that can lead to this kind of overconfidence. The knowledge illusion, I think, can be related in the sense that overconfidence about how much you know often does reflect sort of a lack of expertise. What you usually find is that if you're a novice in some field, you think it's simple. You're like, oh, there's nothing to this. And then once you start digging into the details, like I said, the world's just filled with hidden complexity. So you start digging into the details, and this is an old trope. Like Aristotle talked about this. It's that you start learning what you don't know, and how complex things really are, and how much there is to it. It's like I'm a bluegrass music fanatic, and you talk to someone about bluegrass, and they say, "Oh, it all sounds the same." I'm like, "What are you talking about? No, it doesn't. It's like to me it doesn't.
Right.
And that's because I'm an expert in it,
Mm-hmm.
And the whole world is like that. The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is to know. And so it's related to the Dunning Krueger effect in the sense that that overconfidence about how well you understand things, the knowledge, can often be a reflection of being a novice. So the ideas are connected in that way, for sure.
So then,
David Dunning's is a friend of mine, by the way, and we've spent a lot of
oh,
time.
really?
We've spent a lot of time over the years meeting up at conferences and things like that, and talking about these kind of issues. Yeah, he's a really thoughtful and smart guy.
So I'm talking to the right guy then, it sounds like. So then, do you ever get pushback from people saying, I read your book, I read you and Steve's book, and I see that you're saying that I might not be as smart as I think I am. Actually, I am, and here's why. Do you ever get pushback from people who take offense to the idea that they're actually not, maybe not idiots, but they're just not as smart as they always think they are?
Yes, but it's like 1 out of 100, and the other 99 say, oh my God, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
I was giving a talk once, and I was giving this example of people not understanding how an airplane works or something like that, a helicopter. And some guy in the back room who considers himself, one of the really smart guys in the academic field, raises his hand and says, I know how a helicopter works. And I was like, okay, good point, buddy. Good job.
Right.
Yeah, congratulations. I didn't make him try to explain and prove it, but it kind of misses the point. It's like, okay, fine, you have some expertise in one particular topic, but the truth is the world's just filled with hidden complexity, and nobody can be an expert on everything. There's just too much to know. And by the way, if you try to become an expert in everything, you just, our minds just don't store details. And so you'll quickly forget the details. And you'll be left with this feeling of understanding. And then the next time someone tries to ask you how something works, you'll probably fail again.
Right.
So no, I think that people instantly recognize that this is the case. And in fact, it makes people feel better, I think, to some extent, because we live under this illusion that we should all be experts in everything. It's kind of like society assumes, if you don't know something or you don't understand something, you're embarrassed to ask because there's this expectation that you should know everything and understand everything. And we think of really smart people as being like an encyclopedia where they've memorized a ton of it. It's just, this is all kind of silly, in my opinion. We should feel comfortable and confident about the fact that we are indeed ignorant. And being smart is not about knowing all the details of everything, but it's kind of like knowing how to look in the right places, how to take advantage of your unique skill set, how to learn new things. All those kinds of things I think are much more important than our sort of traditional view of I'm know all kinds of information.
Does the expectation of being smart, or on the flip side, the embarrassment of not knowing something, make it hard to study this? Because I was thinking about the glowing rock study you and Steve Sloman mentioned, and I think on one hand it seems to support your arguments, but on the other hand I keep thinking that this is something like a Jimmy Kimmel Eyewitness News, where if you say something, a scientist knows something, then the people will assume or will act like they know it just out of the fear of embarrassment. Do you think that ever skews the studies or makes it challenging at all?
That's a good question. I think there is some of that could be part of what's going on in some cases. So your point is that it's not really a knowledge illusion. They kind of know they don't know, but they don't want to admit it. I would say maybe that occurs sometimes, but if you look at what actually happens and the way these studies are run, I don't think it would explain much of the effect, because often these people are just responding to an online survey in the comfort of their own home with nobody else around and stuff like that. And moreover, I've done this sort of, the let's sit together and do this experiment at the beginning of a talk, basically. How well do you understand how a toilet works? And it's just so common and prevalent that people go, whoa, wow, that's interesting. And I don't know. And they realize it and they go, oh. So it's not like they're hiding anything from themselves. They're genuinely surprised. And by the way, it happens to me all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, I know that. And then you start talking about it, you're like, oh, wait a second. No, I don't. And that happens just so commonly that I just think that, there is something to people becoming defensive and and not wanting to admit that they don't know. But I think more often it does come as kind of a surprise to ourselves that we don't understand things as well as we thought.
Yeah, well, I know we don't have a ton of time together. We're both pretty busy, but I want to ask you before we go, do you have any final word of advice or any insight that anyone listening should glean from this research or this information that you are presenting?
Sure. So what I would say is that overconfidence is kind of a double-edged sword. At times it's good to be overconfident. Entrepreneurs would probably never start businesses if it wasn't for overconfidence. And most of them fail. Most businesses fail. But occasionally they succeed. And when you succeed, you can have a wild success. And in fact, a society that's vibrant and built on innovation has to have people failing and trying. So overconfidence can be good. At the same time, overconfidence can be really dark and lead to a lot of terrible things. People are dying because of vaccine misinformation, and they're sure that it's all a con to try to, I don't know, input tracking devices in people's blood or whatever, and people are storming the Capitol and killing police officers because they're sure that the election is stolen, or whatever the issue of the day is. Overconfidence can be really, really bad. And so at times, it's important, I think, for people to practice a little bit of intellectual humility and sort of habitually check themselves and check their understanding of these kind of complex issues on which they have really strong opinions, while maintaining sort of a courage to try new things, even if they might fail. So finding that middle ground, that balance, is sort of, I think, the lesson or one of the more important lessons of my research.
Well, Phil, thank you for sitting down and talking with me. This is valuable research, and I hope the torch continues to be passed on and people keep continuing what you're I suppose, teaching the human race in some way, these insights that we can hopefully learn from and not kill each other along the process. So thank you for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.